Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our program. My name is Rick Lee. I'm the Associate Director of the Tyler Clementi Center. And on behalf of Dr. Sue Furr, our Director, I'd like to welcome you to our program this evening, Microaggressions in Everyday Life. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the Tyler Clementi Center. Established 2 years ago, the Tyler Clementi Center is a collaboration between Rutgers University and the Tyler Clementi Foundation. Our mission is to create and share knowledge about young people making the transition to college and coming of age in the digital era. Our funding comes from the Office of the Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs, and we're grateful for the support of Dr. Richard Edwards and his office. You can learn more about the Tyler Clementi Center on our website, clementicenter.rutgers.edu. I would like now to introduce our speakers for tonight's program. And I'll ask the speakers to just raise your hand as I'm introducing you. First, our keynote speaker, Dr. Kevin Nadel. Dr. Nadel is the Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Studies, where he helped to co-found the LGBTQ Scholars of Color Network. He's the author of multiple publications, including one that's called That's So Gay, Microagressions in the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community. He's also an Associate Professor of Psychology, teaching both at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. In 2011, he received the Early Career Award for Contributions to Excellence by the Asian American Psychological Association. And in 2012, he received the Emerging Professional Award for Research from the American Psychological Association, Division 45. Our next speaker will be Zanetta Rego, the Director of the Center for Social Justice Education and LGBT Communities. She graduated in 2010 from the Ramapo College of New Jersey with a BA in History and Women's and Gender Studies and earned a master's degree in Higher Ed and Student Affairs from NYU. At Ramapo, she discovered her passion for student affairs while working as a program coordinator and queer peer services coordinator at the Women's Center on campus. Since joining Rutgers in 2012, Zanetta has done significant work to enhance the Rutgers community, including being one of the key players in the Language Matters campaign that we'll be discussing this evening. Next, we have Ji Lee, the Director of the Asian American Cultural Center and the coordinator for the Committee to Advance the Common Purposes. At the AACC, her primary focus is to raise awareness around Asian American issues as they pertain to college students through creative programming and collaborations with various units and advocating for the needs and concerns of Asian American students. Prior to leading the AACC, Ji worked as a community health outreach worker and health educator at a nonprofit HIV prevention center, at Michigan State University Health Education Department, and at Rutgers University's Department of Health Education. Last, we have Matt Ferguson, right in the corner here, who's the Director of the New Student Orientation and Family Programs. Matt's an alumnus of Rutgers, and he also teaches in the Department of American Studies, so I would encourage those of you who haven't had Matt as a teacher to sign up for his classes. He's a terrific teacher. So let me conclude the introductory remarks by explaining the format of tonight's program. We'll begin with a talk by our keynote speaker. Professor Nadel will frame some of the issues concerning microaggressions that take place in our everyday lives. After that, we'll be viewing a short video entitled, What Kind of Asian Are You? Then Zanetta Rego will offer a response to the video and to Professor Nadel's presentation. And then finally, our program will conclude with a panel discussion on the Language Matters campaign. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker to Rutgers and to the stage, Professor Kevin Nadel.
Hi, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good. I felt like I walked in and it was so quiet, like we were in a library. I want people to scream, are you excited to be here? Woo! All right, awesome. So I'm the type of speaker who, when I speak, I love for people to nod a lot, to see that you're getting it, to snap your fingers, to raise your hand in the air, do something to let me know that you're with me. If you don't like something I have to say, just be quiet. But everything else, feel free to join along. I'm so honored to be here. I'm speaking at various campuses for the past 10 years or so, and I've been speaking more often on the topic of microaggressions. So before I even begin, may I just see a show of hands of how many people here have heard of the term microaggressions before? So a good majority of people. So for those of you who haven't, we'll definitely go through some of the key terms and some of the definitions and so forth. But for those of you who have, I want you to think about some of your past experiences with microaggressions, what you already know about microaggressions, and start to think about ways that we can start to address microaggressions, or at least know how to better address microaggressions in the future. So as I begin, I like to start off by talking about where we are in our society. When we think about where we are in 2015, a lot of people will say things like, we no longer have to worry about race anymore. Race is no longer a problem. We live in a colorblind society where everyone can make it. We have our first president of color, our first African American president, our first biracial president, which indicates that we no longer have to deal with racism anymore. Raise your hand if you've heard people say things like this. Now, when people say things like this, I think that a lot of them are actually trying to be very well-intentioned. That when they say things like this, what they're trying to point out probably is that we have come a long way. That never in our lives before 2009 would we even have thought that we would have a president of color within the next 10, 20 years. And yet we were able to elect an African American president. Never in 20 years would we think that there would be such an increase in access to education, access to employment opportunities, access to a lot of things that we did not have access to, or people of color, communities of color didn't have access to prior. And so we have come a long way. Now, when people say things like this, that we live in a colorblind society, that racism doesn't matter, what they oftentimes fail to recognize is that race does matter. Race affects every aspect of our lives on systemic, institutional, and interpersonal levels. Systemically, we see that race affects everything from educational disparities, that people of color are still not attaining higher degrees of higher education at the same rates as whites are, that people of color still don't have the same types of employment opportunities as whites do. When you look at things like the Fortune 500 companies, which rank the 500 companies and the CEOs of the most successful companies in the United States, what you'll find is out of the 500 that about 20 are people of color, and that is pretty evenly distributed among Black, Latino, and Asian Americans, that there are very few women of color in those positions, and that in general, women of color aren't succeeding in the same way that white males are. And so race still matters in our country. What we also recognize is that there are lots of health disparities that affect people of color, and that there are even a lot of laws in place that don't necessarily have the best interest of people of color in mind. And so when we think about this colorblind society, while it's an idealistic thought that people have, it simply isn't where we are at this point in our lives. And when we look at somebody like President Obama and we see him on the Senate or Congress floors, what you'll notice is that there are very few people that look like him. And so while we might have a president of color, we have very few people of color that are in that same type of position as he is, or at least on the way to the same types of positions that he is. And so we have come a long way, but we have to recognize that racism still affects us in so many different ways. A lot of times people will say that racism doesn't exist anymore because they don't see things like this anymore. They don't see people being overtly racist. They don't see as much hate crimes as they did perhaps 20, 30 years ago. And they don't participate in these sorts of activities. And so they say, because I don't participate in that, the world isn't racist. Now, as we've seen what's been happening these past, particularly in the media, what's been publicized this past year is that race definitely does matter, that there still is a number of hate crimes affecting communities of color, and that there still is a big problem regarding racism in the criminal justice system, particularly when it comes to police brutality. And so while people still might want to advocate that we don't experience things like this, perhaps it still is a reality for many people. When people think about race, they oftentimes think that they know what they're supposed to say and what they're not supposed to say. That people want to be good people, good law-abiding citizens. They want to see people as equals, but perhaps they don't realize some of the implicit biases that they might have. In social psychology, for the past 20, 30, 40 years, there has been an increase on the research on implicit bias, which basically finds that regardless of how good of a person you think you are, that we all hold these unconscious biases about people, particularly people that are different from us. And these are scientific, empirically based studies that support that even though you might think that you don't have these biases against others, that you definitely still have these biases, these prejudices that you sometimes don't even recognize are operating in your life. And so this is something that we have to think about, that we might not be consciously participating in this, but maybe we might be consciously or unconsciously participating in things like this. So this is an Asian American woman and a man, he's a white man. He doesn't have to be white, he could be of any other racial group, and he's telling her, "You are so exotic." Now, when someone says that to a young woman, a woman of color, an Asian American woman, or another woman of color, someone might say, well, what's wrong with that? He's complimenting her. He's telling her that she's attractive. He's telling her that she's beautiful, and he's paying her a compliment. What's wrong with that? Now, for a lot of Asian American women and other women of color, they might not react so well to this because perhaps the message that they perceive he is communicating is that she's being a token, that she's being objectified, that he is only attracted to her because of he views her as some sort of stereotype or trophy wife or Madame Butterfly figure. And so while some women might view this as a compliment, or some people might view this as a compliment, perhaps there are a lot of people that would not view this as a compliment. In fact, they might become upset about this, outraged by this, particularly if this is something that occurs very frequently in their life. Now, this is what we're talking about when we talk about microaggressions, the subtle forms of discrimination that are often not malicious in intent, that are often unconscious, that people might not even be aware that they committed, but have a profound impact on the people who experience them. When we think about sexism and heterosexism, we see similar trajectories. With sexual harassment laws particularly that have been enforced in the past 20 years, what you see is that a lot of men might know what they're supposed to say or not allowed to say in the workplace. And so we have laws to protect against unwanted sexual advances in the workplace. We have human resources departments that specialize in sexual harassment cases. Now, what about some of these subtle forms of sexism that people might experience, not just in the workplace, but in other aspects of their life? When every time a man might glance at a woman's body, how might that convey a message that she is an object to him? Every time that a man tells a woman in a subtle way that he doesn't think she's capable of doing something, how might that convey a subtle message? Those types of instances are things that you might go to your human resources about, but they might not have enough to make a case. That they might say that, I'm sorry you're experiencing that, but we need more tangible evidence in order for us to file a sexual harassment case. These are what we're talking about when we talk about microaggressions. The subtle things, the things that are difficult to prove, the things that might make someone feel uncomfortable or frustrated or angry, but yet there might not be enough tangible evidence to support it. When we talk about heterosexism and transphobia, we see a similar trajectory, that in a lot of places that are more open-minded and liberal, you might not see as much overt discrimination against LGBTQ communities. However, we still see this as being a very common thing across the United States. People are a lot more open in their heterosexism and transphobia, that perhaps it's acceptable to say things like "that's so gay" or "no homo," or people to call transgender people trannies or she-males, and perhaps that might be much more acceptable. We see some of the studies from GLSEN, which does annual reports on campus climate in high schools with LGBTQ students, and we find that 9 out of 10 students in high school who self-identify as LGBTQ will report that they experience overt discrimination in their classrooms, and that oftentimes their parents don't do anything about it. So we see that there still is a presence of overt discrimination against LGBTQ people. But what about the subtle forms of discrimination against LGBTQ people? Places particularly that pride themselves on being liberal and open-minded. Perhaps someone might not say anything explicitly homophobic, but perhaps subtle behaviors or statements might convey their bias. When a person assumes that someone else is heterosexual without any other reason to think so other than the fact that you meet someone and you assume that most people are heterosexual, what message is conveyed? How does this affect a person who is in a new environment when somebody promotes heterosexuality as the norm? I know for me, a common thing that happens to me a lot is I'll go to a new environment, a new job, some sort of new environment, and someone will say, "So Kevin, where are your wife and kids?" And I'll say, "In my parents' imagination?" But why are we promoting heterosexuality or cisgenderism as the norm? Why do we continue for that to happen? Now, so microaggressions, the definition is that microaggressions are brief and commonplace, daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards various people, particularly those of historically marginalized groups. Now let's break this down very quickly. So one, microaggressions are brief and commonplace, meaning that these instances can last all of a few seconds. An African-American man walks on an elevator and the people who are already on the elevator move to the side and grab their purses or wallets. That lasted all of 3 seconds, but yet that could have a profound effect on him in the moment as well as him in his everyday life. They're commonplace, meaning that they have the capacity to happen at any given moment. Microaggressions aren't just occurring in the workplace or in schools, they also occur on the streets, at the supermarket, on the subway, even in people's families. That people who are different in some way from their other family members often report feeling microaggressed in their own homes. So people cannot escape microaggressions. They can be verbal, meaning that they could be statements that people make, jokes that people make. They can be behavioral, actions, body language, facial expressions, body movements, behaviors that people engage in. And they could even be environmental. The very environment that somebody is in, the climate that somebody is in can be a microaggression. Or even things like decor can be microaggressive. For example, I went to Columbia University, and as a lot of Ivies do, if you walk around, you'll see that a lot of the buildings are named after older white men, and that there are very few, if any, buildings named after people of color. How might that in itself be a microaggression? When you walk into these buildings, you see these large oil paintings of these white men who the buildings are named after. What is it like to walk into buildings and see people who don't look like you? How might that in itself be an environmental microaggression? Microaggressions can be intentional, meaning that somebody is aware that they said something to you. The man who said that to the woman that she's so exotic, he was conscious of this behavior. He knew what he was saying. However, while he intended it, he perhaps didn't realize that it would have an effect on her. So he intended it one way, but he didn't know that it would offend her. Jokes that people make are often intentional. They knew what joke that they were going to say. It came out of their mouth. But it isn't until somebody tweets about it or demands an apology that then that person retracts the joke or says that they're sorry for it. And so versus in 20 years ago, if somebody made a racist joke, they might stand by their racist joke. But now people apologize for things, perhaps because they're genuine, but also perhaps because they are sorry that they got in trouble for it. Microaggressions can be unintentional. A lot of people engage in a lot of behaviors that they don't even realize they had engaged in. People who treat an African-American man like a criminal as he walks on the elevator oftentimes don't even realize they had done it. Somebody who makes a statement that is offensive to LGBTQ folks oftentimes didn't even realize that they had said it. And when you ask them, why did you say that, they might become defensive and say, I didn't say that, what are you talking about? But you know that that's exactly what they said. Microaggressions have a range of effects on people. Sometimes they can feel overtly hostile. People in our research studies have talked about feeling like they were in hostile environments because of these microaggressions, particularly if you were the only person of color or a woman or queer person or trans person in an office building and you felt excluded on a regular basis, that could feel like a hostile environment. But other people mention that these microaggressions are more negative, that they feel like a little ouch. But what the research is finding is that the accumulation of these ouches are what has an effect on people's mental health, their physical health, their self-esteem, and other outcomes as well. And finally, microaggressions particularly affect those of historically marginalized groups. Now, inevitably, whenever I give a talk about microaggressions, somebody will say something like, well, what about microaggressions against white people? What about microaggressions against men? Well, what research is finding is that people of all groups can experience microaggressions. So if you belong to a dominant group, someone can make a joke that hurts your feelings or upsets you. But what the research is finding is that one, that those wouldn't happen as frequently as they happen to people of historically marginalized groups. And two, that they wouldn't have as much of an effect on you as they would for people of historically marginalized groups. So for an example, me as a man, as a cisgender man, I can be in a group where women might say negative things about men, but one, that probably wouldn't happen as frequently as the types of things that women experience or the types of microaggressions that women experience. And two, that it wouldn't affect me as much because it didn't happen so frequently, and also because I belong to the dominant group. That because I belong to the dominant group, it might be easier for me to brush off or for it not to affect me as much as opposed to somebody who belongs to the more marginalized group. Now, there are three forms of microaggressions that I'll talk about very briefly. One is microassaults. Microassaults are like the old-fashioned forms of discrimination, things that people say that feel aggressive. Now, the difference between microaggressions and aggressions can really depend on the situation, but a lot of times it can depend on intent. I mentioned before that a lot of times people will say something that to some people sounds overtly racist, homophobic, but they might not mean it or they might not know the impact that it would have on someone. These would be examples of microassaults. The things that people say that sound hostile or feel hostile, but maybe they might not mean it in as much of an aggressive way. And I'll give you some examples of that. Micro-insults are microaggressions that convey some sort of insult, usually based on some sort of stereotype, towards a person of a marginalized group. These can be both behavioral or verbal. And the micro-invalidations are statements that people make that negate somebody's reality. Now, here are some examples from good old BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed has done a great job of talking about microaggressions to the general public, and particularly for young people. They have a couple of articles that I liked. One was on LGBT microaggressions, and one was on racial microaggressions. So the first is this young man who says that hearing the phrase "no homo" is a microaggression. How many people have heard this phrase before? All right, so no homo essentially means that when a man touches another man, usually it's between men, but it can be used between women as well. But when a man touches another man, that he's fixing my tie or getting some lint off my shoulder, and then he backs off, and then he says, no homo. And no homo magically negates that there was anything gay about the situation, so thereby no homo. Now, what I find interesting about no homo is that while you were touching me, you were thinking gay things, so maybe it's a lot of homo? I don't know. But hearing something like this can feel harmless, that the person's saying, no, I'm not disliking or hating on gay people, but imagine if you were somebody who was struggling with your identity, or if you were the only LGBTQ kid in your class and you heard people say things like no homo, what kind of an impact would that have on you, particularly in your ability to come out of the closet? This is an example of a racial microaggression. To paraphrase, this young woman talks about how she's sitting in a library and another young man says that a girl moved because she smells like rice. So saying that the Asian American woman smells like rice. Now, this is an example of a microassault in my opinion, because if you were to confront this young man who made this comment, he probably would say something like, no, I was just joking. No, don't take that so seriously. No, you heard me wrong. As opposed to somebody who was blatantly racist might hold to his bias and say, yeah, I said you smell like rice. But a lot of times people will say things, but retract the intention behind it. And so this would be an example of a micro assault. This is an example of a micro-insult. So these are microaggressions that convey bias. This is a young lesbian-identified woman, and she says that men have told her and her partner, that's totally cool with me as long as I can watch. Now, a lot of queer, lesbian, and bi women will talk about how a lot of men exoticize them, sexualize them, presume that they would want you to be part of their relationship or engage in sexual activities with them, which is something that they wouldn't be, particularly if they're lesbian identified, they're not attracted to men, but yet, for some reason, these men think that they can place themselves in their sexual relationships. This is a young man who says that people have told him, you can't read that, but it says, you don't act like a normal black person, you know? A lot of times people will compliment people of color saying that they're not like the others, you know, you speak so well, you're not like those other people are, you're educated, not like that. So they have a prejudice that they have against a whole group of people and they're saying you're not like them, so they're complimenting you on that. So again, this would be a microaggression because it conveys that you have a stereotype about a group, but yet you're saying that you're trying to compliment this particular person. This is a micro-invalidation, a statement that negates a person's reality. This is a gender nonconforming person who says that they have heard people say to them, quote, I'm not being homophobic, you're just being too sensitive. So anytime somebody denies your reaction to something, says that it's your fault, that you're the one who's taking it so seriously, that would be considered a microaggression. And finally, this young woman says that people have told her, Courtney, I never see you as a black girl, hashtag open your eyes. Now, color blindness is a very common microaggression because people will say that I don't see color. Now, the problem with that is twofold. One is that unless you have any sort of visual impairment, you do see my color. You see what I look like in the same way that you see my face, you see how tall I am, you see what you perceive of my gender and my size and all these other things. So why are we afraid to say that we see somebody's racial background? But two, the other problem to this is by saying you don't see somebody's color, you're sending the message that race isn't important. However, for this person, it might be a very salient part of their life, that they live their life affected by their race and affected by racism. And so while you're trying to communicate that you believe in equality, you're negating that race is important to them. So there's been a lot of research on microaggressions over the past 10 years. It's focused on so many different groups, including African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, multiracial people, women, lesbian, gay, bisexual people, transgender people, Muslims, people with disabilities, and recently on intersectional identity. So the intersections of more than one of your identities. So what are the microaggressions you experience as an Asian American woman, as a lesbian with a disability, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to briefly talk about some of these microaggression categories to give you some more examples of what microaggressions look like. Ascription of intelligence, these are microaggressions in which you presume that somebody would have a certain level of intellect as a result of their identities. So for example, a lot of times people will tell an African American or Latino person something like, wow, you are so articulate. Has anyone ever told you how articulate you are? Now, when somebody hears that, they say, well, what's wrong with that? You're paying that person a compliment. But to overemphasize it over and over again perhaps sends the message that you did not expect that person to be articulate. When Barack Obama was running for president first in 2007 and 2008, it came out that Joe Biden a year prior had said, I like that Barack Obama. He is articulate and clean. So our current Vice President of the United States once said that Barack Obama was articulate and clean. How might he overemphasize that? Because he presumed that President Obama would not be articulate nor clean, and how might that be based on one of his biases? For women, a lot of times women, and this is all based on a lot of our research, that women will talk about raising their hand in a classroom or in a board meeting, and no one really listens to them, but then a man repeats pretty much the same idea and he gets credit for it. So this is an idea of a microaggression based on intelligence. For Asian Americans, they experience the opposite. Because of the model minority myth, a lot of times people presume that Asian Americans would be good at math or sciences. And so they'll say things to me like, hey, Kevin, can you help me fix my computer? And I'll say, I'm a psychologist. I can ask you how your computer feels, and that's about it. But presuming that somebody would be good at something, a lot of times people would say, well, that's a positive stereotype, isn't it? Well, the problem is that the model minority myth is one, a myth, that not all Asian Americans would be good at math and sciences or computers. And two, think about the systemic repercussions of the model minority myth. Because Asian Americans are stereotyped to always be smart, perhaps there aren't the resources that they need. Perhaps there aren't scholarships available for them. Perhaps there aren't support services that target them when there are, in fact, lots of Asian Americans that aren't doing well. In fact, a recent statistic found that Hmong Americans, so a Southeast Asian group, Hmong Americans, that only 40% of them graduate from high school in the United States. And so this is an example of the opposite of the model minority myth. One last description of intelligence, people with disabilities. Oftentimes somebody might have a physical disability and people will do things like talk to them very slowly in a condescending tone. Presuming that they would have a cognitive disability even though they have no cognitive disability at all and it's only a physical disability. Alien in one's own land, these are examples where people presume that people of color, particularly Asian Americans and Latinos, would be perpetual foreigners, that there would be no chance that they would be American born. For example, when somebody says, so where are you from? And then I say, oh, I'm from New York. No, where are you really from? Oh yeah, well, I was born in California. No, where are you really from? San Francisco. No, where are you really from? I'm not gonna give you my address. What message is sent in those cases? That perhaps you didn't believe that I would be American, nor that my family could have been here for 4 generations. When people hear that, they're like, so am I not allowed to ask people where they're from? No, of course you're allowed to ask people where they're from, but think about the context. If you're meeting somebody for the very first time, do you need to know what their ethnic background is? If I'm sitting at a bar, does your pickup line have to be, what are you? Is it bothering you so much that you don't know what my ethnic background is that you need to stop me and ask me? Perhaps if you're working with a coworker, it's more than appropriate to ask them what their background is, but perhaps you might want to ask them what you're intending to ask. So instead of where are you from, and they tell you the city they were born in, perhaps you can say, well, what is your ethnic background? What's your family's immigration story? And that might be an appropriate question to ask. Assumption of inferiority, similar to the assumption of intellectual inferiority, these are microaggressions in which an individual is presumed to not be as good enough as someone else. For women in a lot of our studies, they've reported things like a woman will be holding a box and a man will take it away from them and say, no, no, you shouldn't be carrying that, and sending the message that she wasn't capable of carrying a box. So women oftentimes experience this as men telling them that they're inferior in some way. Now, does that mean you can't help a woman carry a box? Absolutely not. You can ask a person in general if they need help carrying a box, if they look like they're struggling, and if they say they don't need help, then they don't need help. So think about the intention. And if you only ask women to carry boxes, but you don't ask men to carry boxes, think about what bias that might mean for you. If you only hold doors open for women but not for other men, what is that message that you are communicating? Assumptions of inferiority can also be when people presume that people of color wouldn't be in leadership positions. So in a lot of the studies, people talked about instances where people would say things I want to talk to your manager, and then they would say, I am the manager, and then the person would say, no, no, I want to talk to your real manager. So presuming that people of color couldn't be in higher positions. The assumption of criminal status, these are examples where people of color particularly are presumed to be criminals. So this has to do with police profiling, to even store owners or store clerks following around young people of color in stores. Transgender people have reported microaggressions regarding this. A lot of transgender women, particularly transgender women of color in places like New York and Washington, D.C., say that police also stop and frisk them and profile them and presume that they are sex workers. In a lot of these cities, up until recently, if a transgender woman was found with 1 to 3 condoms on her person, that she would be arrested for sex work. And that was enough to arrest her. And so how might that be based on somebody's biases? The assumption of universal experience, these are microaggressions in which a person presumes that another person is exactly like every other person in the group. So telling somebody you're not really Latino because you don't speak Spanish, or you're not really black because you like Taylor Swift, or you're not really gay because you're too masculine, or you're not really lesbian because you're too pretty. So things that are based on people's stereotypes that you convey to others. Another common instance that came up was a lot of people of color talked about how they were often mistaken for the other person of color. So if you're a student in the class, you're one of 2 Latina students in class, The professor might call you by the name of the other Latina student, and that might be a common thing. Perhaps that could be just the professor has a bad memory, but what does it mean when one Latina student is 40 years old, the other Latina student is 20 years old, one is light-skinned, one is dark-skinned? Why is it so hard to tell the difference between the two? How might that be based on a person's bias? I'm going to end with second-class citizen. These are microaggressions in which somebody receives less preferential treatment than somebody else. So when a person of color, for example, gets seated in the back of the restaurant, or their servers don't serve them as quickly as they notice they serve other people in the restaurant, when a taxi cab driver passes a person of color, when an airport security person stops a Muslim person as in the airport security line, all examples of treating somebody like a second-class citizen. So some of the research on microaggressions find that when people experience microaggressions, that they have acute emotional reactions, everything from belittlement to anger to rage to frustration, and even chronic mental health problems, that the more microaggressions that you experience in your life, the more likely that you would feel depression, anxiety, and trauma. Now, these come from a lot of qualitative research in which people report oftentimes experiencing microaggressions on a regular basis. And so imagine, again, being the only person of color, the only LGBTQ person, the only Muslim person, the only woman in a certain environment. How might this lead for you to become depressed or anxious or to feel trauma? Some of the quantitative research has found that microaggressions influence everything from depressive symptoms and positive affect, meaning one's view of the world, that the more microaggressions you experience, the more likely you are to present with symptoms of depression, as well as viewing the world as a less safe or less just place. Also that it would have effects on things like binge drinking, self-esteem, physical health issues, and identity development. I'm going to end by talking about just some recommendations, and this was originally for people, working professionals, but we can apply it to students as well. Provide a safe space in which your students or colleagues can talk about microaggressions. Be able to create a space where people feel comfortable approaching you if they experience a microaggression in that space. So for example, in a classroom setting, professors might want to talk about social justice issues more than once, perhaps even earlier on in the class, so that students know that it's a safe place to bring up social justice issues. In places like student life or residence life, having workshops and trainings like you are doing here on campus about social justice issues and inclusion can provide that safe space for people to talk about microaggressions. Be willing to, when you make mistakes. Everyone commits microaggressions, whether you like it or not. Even people who study microaggressions, people who train on microaggressions, we are able to commit microaggressions ourselves. That if you belong to some dominant group, you belong to a group in which you are normalized. And as a result of that, you might have difficulty seeing some of the biases that you have towards other groups. So for example, for me as a cisgender person, meaning that I identify with my birth sex, I'm a non-transgender person, I don't even think about things like having to go to the bathroom. When I need to go to the bathroom, I can ask where the men's room is, and I would be pointed to that direction, and I could pee in peace. But for a lot of transgender people, this is something that they don't have access to, or they have to have special accommodations, or they have to go to a restroom on the other side of campus simply just to go to the bathroom. And these are things that I might not even think about. As a cisgender person, I might not think about pronouns as often because most people will look at me and be able to identify my pronouns and use them accordingly. But for a transgender person, perhaps people might have difficulty with their pronoun usage and therefore mess up or slip or overtly use incorrect pronouns. And so that's something that I might not be aware of in my everyday life. Be willing to discuss your own relationships with people. Dynamics happen all the time between various groups because we all are so complex in our identities and our experiences, there are lots of interpretations for microaggressions, but be willing to have the discussion or the conversation about it. A lot of times people are very quick to say, no, that's not what I meant, I'm not being racist. And they'll shut down the conversation and then oftentimes blame the person and say, no, that's all in your head. Instead of saying something like that, perhaps you might want to say something like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Let me hear what you have to say. Here's what I intended, and I know that that still hurt your feelings. And I imagine perhaps that this might have something to do with my implicit biases, but I apologize for it. So not negating a person's experience or a person's lived experience or realities, but encouraging that dialogue between the two parties. So finally, I just want to end, I know I went a little bit over time, but I want to end by saying that I think that people need to continue to have these conversations, not just about microaggressions, but about social justice and inclusion in general. I know that oftentimes it can be easy to only have these conversations on campus and within your circle of friends. But what I like to challenge everyone to do is to have this conversation with somebody who it might be uncomfortable to have. Have this conversation with your parents. Have this conversation with a sibling or a best friend from back home who you don't talk about any of these issues with. It's really our responsibility if we want the next generation to feel a greater sense of community and inclusion that we all do all of our parts to educate others about this. I firmly believe that we've come a long way, and I firmly believe that in order for us to go an even longer way, that each person has to do their part to make a difference. So thank you very much. I had a great time. Take care.
Let's give another round of applause to Dr. Nadell.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right? There you go. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
Hi there. I mean before that.
Hi. Before
Nice
I was
day,
born.
huh? Yeah, like, well,
Yeah,
where are your
finally,
people
right?
from? Where are you from? Your English
Well,
is
my
perfect.
great-grandma was from San
Seoul.
Diego. We speak
Korean.
English there.
I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or... But I was leaning more towards Korean. Wrong.
Amazing. Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually
There's a
lived
really
there.
good teriyaki barbecue place near my
Before I
apartment.
was born.
I actually really like where are your people from?
Cool. What about you? Well, my great-grandma
San
was
Francisco.
from Seoul. But where are
Korean.
you from?
I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean.
Really?
But I was leaning more
Native
towards
American?
Korean. No.
Amazing.
Regular American. I'm Shasino. There's a really good teriyaki. I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh.
I actually really like kimchi.
What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toilet.
Sorry about that. Let's try this one more time.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, well, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean. But I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
I'm Shasino. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap, beware Jack the Ripper. Bloody hell! Pip, cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing. Fish and chips, pheasants, clotted cream, bangers and mash, Guinness, ploughman's lunch, a spot of tea, a pint of ale.
All right, I'd like to invite all the panelists to join me on stage, please. So we'll begin with Zanetta's comments, please, and then we'll proceed with the rest of the panel.
Hi, everybody. So I feel as though I don't have much left to say, simply because that was so thorough. Thank you so much. The video that you all just watched is actually one of the first components of the Language Matters online training and tutorial, which, by show of hands, how many of you have gone through that? Great. And how many of you have seen the poster that is attached to that campaign, just around campus in general? Great. Usually it's more folks. More folks don't realize that there is an online component to that poster. And so I just was asked to come here and talk about sort of the implementation of that project and also how we've seen it grow on campus and impact the campus. So essentially, this was way back last summer in August, and there was a lot of conversations across the Division of Student Affairs, which our unit is a part of, which actually all of our units are a part of, about things that we could do to really impact the first year experience, specifically as students are arriving on campus around diversity and social justice. And so within that committee, actually Mike Tolbert, who is back there from Residence Life, hello, came across a campaign from the University of Maryland called the Inclusive Language Campaign. And essentially what you see behind me is from that campaign. Now, we all talked about what we could do to really get students to think about the impact of the language that they're learning, right? Intent versus impact, I think, was our main goal. So a lot of our students, especially when we see acts of bias happen on campus, less overt acts of bias. I think overt bias is relatively obvious, right? It's the more covert acts of bias that we were really trying to get at. Students constantly respond with, well, I didn't mean it that way. Right, and I don't want to just say students, actually, either. I think we all say, well, I didn't mean it that way. I didn't know it would impact you that way. And so what we were trying to do was get students to think about the things they were saying before they actually said it. And so this campaign really sort of came into the committee through Mike, and we got permission from the University of Maryland to use this graphic back here. Now, we didn't really edit the graphic per se, because we wanted to focus more so on just getting it out there. It was relatively quick turnaround time. And I think after reflecting on some of the words up here, we would definitely change, possibly even next year, the use of the word terrorist, right? And then the response specifically. So not saying, would you say that if you knew I was a US veteran, but instead saying, would you say that if you knew I was part of the Muslim community? I think that was one of the main things that we got, but we didn't edit the campaign because what we were actually focused on was this online training. So at University of Maryland, they follow up this poster with in-person training. Now, University of Maryland is large. Rutgers is very large. And what we realized was there was no way that we were going to have the capacity, especially from, let's say, just even the diversity offices alone. So when I say diversity office specifically, I'm talking about My center, the Center for Social Justice Education in LGBT Communities, the Asian American Cultural Center, G Center, the Center for Latino Arts and Culture, and the Paul Robeson Cultural Center. We work as a collective within student affairs. And what we realized was that there was no way we were going to be able to go into every residence hall, into every classroom, into every student group. We have over 400 of them. And there was no way that we were going to be able to respond to all the different acts of bias in person, right? There's just no way, although we're trying. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And so what we designed, semi as a collective, was this online piece, which folks can go through on their own. And that's why we wanted to show you the video, so you can get a sense of the type of material that is within that training. The training blends both mixed media, right? So things like the visual campaign that Dr. Nadal had showed earlier, and then also a bunch of different videos from different sources that really sort of flip the script. So that video that you saw there, I think, why not? We'll pretend we're in a mini Language Matters training right now. What were some of the microaggressions that you saw? By show, anybody want to raise their hand? Go ahead. Absolutely. Anything else? Go ahead.
You referred to himself as regular American, and kind of just assumed that, and when she said you're not Native American, I guess you just assumed that both that, I guess, American meant white, and that she wasn't American, so she wasn't.
Absolutely. So this idea of this sort of perpetual foreigner, right? And so if you listen really closely, his family had actually been here generationally for less time than her family, right? Her great-grandmother emigrated from Korea. His grandfather emigrated from England. And so I think it's something that when you flip, we use that video to specifically show the reverse of microaggressions and how ridiculous they sound. And often they sound so ridiculous because we don't hear them as much. And so I like to say, you said, what are you, right? Or where are you from? When we do the Language Matters training for folks, I like to tell people to leave it open-ended. Right? You're going to get so much more of a rich answer from people if you say, tell me about yourself. What's your story? And then, of course, on the flip side of that, expect to be able to do the same thing for them, right? Because that's cultural exchange as opposed to cultural stereotyping. So anywho, neither here nor there, you should definitely come to a Language Matters training if you haven't already been through one. But in our first year after implementing this online training part, we've actually trained upward almost 1,000 students and some staff and faculty as well on Language Matters. And I think primarily it's come from our center. We've trained about 700 from our center, and then other units have taken that training and done it with their staff team and their student staff team. And what we've seen is that a lot of students didn't necessarily have the language to really think through what a microaggression was, or knew that they had experienced something similar but didn't have a word for it. And so and I know folks are going to also talk about the experience a bit of either giving the training or how the program has grown, but essentially what we realized was that people were really hungry to have the language to talk about the things they were experiencing on campus. And so I think that has been one of the main impacts of Language Matters, and also people are starting to dialogue about these things. The one thing that I want to say is because we're focusing primarily on not necessarily the negative intent, but the negative impact, having and talking about Language Matters and talking about microaggressions has really given people, I think some people, the space to be patient with one another, right? So when we're in social justice spaces, I run a social justice center, I think there's a lot of focus on knowing the right thing to say, being down with the lingo, of not offending somebody, of walking on eggshells, and I think that's because people want to have the best of intentions, right? I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But when we talk about microaggressions and we talk about not necessarily having a malicious intent, it really allows for space to call people in, right? So instead of calling people out, I'm going to care about you. I'm going to show some compassion. I'm going to understand that that's not what you meant, and then I'm going to explain to you why that hurt, and then we're going to move on. Right? I think that's something that's pretty much impossible to do when it's overt, right? When it's malicious. But when we talk about microaggressions, it gives us the space to be human, to make mistakes and to actually grow as a community. And so that's what I've really seen Language Matters and this whole campaign and discussion around microaggressions impacting the community.
Thank you. Next up, we'll have Ji Lee, the director of the Asian American Cultural Center.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to sort of talk about, before Language Matters was created, a little bit more on some of the practices that have taken place and some things that our center has actually been involved with. Back in 2011, I see a couple Res Life folks back there. We were asked to go in and train the RAs for a diversity training during the summer. And they kind of really wanted us to focus on the Asian American student experience. So what I did was I got a group of students together just to query them about their experiences and what really irked them and what's something that they would like for other students to know. And that conversation essentially was about microaggressions. And the conversation was pretty much centered around very much the things that you saw in that Ken Tanaka video. So then from that point, we crafted this exercise, this interactive activity titled, Do You Speak Caucasian? And we essentially had, the students work in a fishbowl type of exercise where the inner circle sort of knew a certain script and the outer circle didn't. And so we basically flipped the script. And it really started some interesting conversation right then and there. And a number of our students, a number of our Asian American students said, you know how many people actually say and ask me the question, so do you speak Asian? And that was where they came up with the do you speak Caucasian? So that said, we then sort of moved on to partner with, there was a 2-year-long initiative called Project Civility that Dean Mark Schuster had implemented, and it was an incredible series of programs that lasted for 2 years. And so we also partnered with him on that. And then sort of another level within student affairs, there's diversity trainings that take place each year. And one year the focus was related to ableism and disability. And again, thinking back to what we were noticing at our center, the language that was being heard around our center, I couldn't help but hear a lot of, that's so retarded. Like a lot of our students were just saying that phrase over and over and over again. And so again, we thought, okay, what's something that we could try to do? We're being very intentional about the ways in which we can make some change related to language. And we created a campaign against that word, using photos from our own students, and created some posters and put them around the center. And I don't have hard data. This wasn't research that we were marking off here and collecting numbers per se, but I have to say that in probably a 2 to 3 year span, the language has changed at the center. And what used to be so heavily, just overtly stated all the time, I've noticed a change, and our staff have noticed a change, and our students have noticed a change. So now fast forward a couple years after this creation of the Language Matters campaign, which we're so grateful for Zanetta's leadership in really creating it and kicking it off the ground and getting it going. Our center's been involved, as well as the other centers, in terms of training our students, getting our student leaders trained. We have an annual leadership retreat. All of our student staff are trained with the Language Matters campaign. And what I think is the most beautiful piece of it all is that our cultural umbrella councils have gotten together, the student leadership have gotten together, the Asian Student Council, the Queer Caucus, Latino Student Council, and the United Black Council. And they got together as a leadership to say, hey, this is important and we want to work on this together, and they themselves took on the Language Matters campaign and did their own program with a larger group. So I just wanted to kind of share the way that language has played out in the students who I interact with on a more regular basis at the center, the ways in which it's been implemented with training, the ways in which, even from within the center, how we've identified the need to change our own language, and the type of impact that has in really trying to emphasize the creating a safe space and environment for students, and really encouraging our entire community to participate in this. So those are my 2 cents.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Matt Ferguson, the Director of New Student Orientation and Family Programs.
Good evening, everybody. Very pleased to be here and join this. I'll tell you that while this is the first official year that I'm serving as the Director of New Student Orientation, I've been involved with the New Student Orientation program here at Rutgers for 7 years. And I've seen the program transition from what we sort of unaffectionately call a talking heads style of orientation, where everybody gets their 30 minutes, to an orientation program that is focused on messaging, and messaging specifically for our incoming first-year students. Now, you'll often hear people say that, especially when they talk about an institution, that you can see an institution's priorities in its budget, right? What it spends its money on. Well, in orientation, you can see an institution's priorities in the schedule. And for us, we had to, specifically this year, which we're really excited about, after sort of piloting the program with our student leaders through Zanetta's office, we have made the decision to allocate a specific portion of time in the orientation schedule for first-year students to go through a modified version of the Language Matters program. So at the end of next August, we will have 5,000 to 6,000 first-year students who have gone through this program. And for me, it was important for us to put that into place because, again, orientation is so often thought to be get people really excited about going to the school they're going to. And part of me says, we already have their money, so we don't really have to get them excited as much as, well, I'm half joking, as much as we have to tell them what we expect, right? We want to show them, like, you're about to come to Rutgers, and this is what this new community expects of you. And part of that is talking about these critical, hard to talk about issues. Now, why are we choosing something like a Language Matters? Well, it's obviously great, okay, first of all. It's a great program with some great results. But also because we have to scratch the surface, right? We have 18 hours with first-year students. We can't do a privilege walk in that amount of time, right? We want to start the conversation. We don't necessarily want to rip anything open at that moment because we do have a lot of things we still have to accomplish. But what I think we do is we start to talk about things that maybe folks have never really talked about. We often ask the question, what's the difference between a high school senior and a first-year college student? 3 months. That's the difference. Or, the most amazing summer I've ever had in my life. Right? That's the difference. So we have to meet people where they're at. We have to meet our students, 80% from New Jersey, who don't think they have a problem necessarily with issues relating to social justice until we start talking about the language and until we start talking about the expectations of the community. So we are really excited that we're putting this into the program. We have 0 results yet because we haven't done it yet. It's starting this summer. But we will have 5,000 to 6,000 first-year students who go through it. We're going to have some assessment data. And I think we're going to start to majorly sort of change the tide of how conversation and language happens. If nothing else, we're not going to change everybody's life in that 45-minute or 1-hour session during orientation. But we are going to start to, at the very minimum, help people who are passionate about it know that this university is passionate about it. And we're also going to help people who are maybe a little bit on the edge realize you might want to get on this ship here, right? Get on this boat of understanding and conversation, because we're not going to tolerate the type of language or the type of actions that maybe were tolerated in your previous institution. Thank you.
So I hope that you'll all have a sense about the kind of history. G was talking about a pre-Language Matters campaign a few years ago, and now what we've launched this past year is the Language Matters campaign that is organized by Zanetta and the other 3 cultural centers, and the implementation coming this year in orientation to really educate first-year students about the importance of being cognizant of the language that we all use on a daily basis. So that's really to give you really a long trajectory of the commitment of this university, long-standing commitment to making sure that we are living, we are civil to each other, and that we are really honoring each other's experiences. So I want us now to open up for questions, for responses, and also to include any comments or questions to Dr. Nadel in his presentation as well, because I certainly learned a lot in terms of the kinds of different categories of microaggressions, which I found really, really useful, and also the various examples. So I'll open up for conversation with the audience and also with the panelists here. And there are microphones. Thank you, Mark.
Hi, so that's really exciting that you're going to have that Language Matters training as part of your orientation for the undergraduate students. Are you thinking of doing that for the graduate students or the faculty, or some sort of thing so that Rutgers as an institution sort of reinforces that after the orientation?
So, well, I think everybody should, go through it, but I only currently sort of am overseeing undergraduate new student orientation, but I think you were about to.
So it happens when people request it, and that's something that our office works really hard to do, is we have an open request form. We've done this training for graduate students. We've done this training for health providers, actually. G and I came in for the continuing education credits that all of health services has to do. We have done it for faculty. We've gone into classrooms. We've gone into FIGs. It really just depends on request and the amount of staff we have to be able to give that training. Graduate orientation obviously it's not the same thing as undergraduate orientation. Every program does their own thing. And so it's hard to be in all those spaces, but something that we do work hard to do is to make sure that we have an accessible online form for folks to come in and request training. And we'll do it for student groups, classes, staff meetings. It really it doesn't matter. We'll come in as long as you folks request it. So if you have a group who you think would be interested, socialjustice.rutgers.edu. You're welcome.
That's a really good question, and I think that I want to just pose a similar kind of question to our panelists to think about whether you've had experience after launching this past year or any other past experiences. My question is related to more international students and the kinds of cultural issues that may be specific in the campaign or in the category, and whether or not that's translatable or intranslatable in particular kinds of ways. And that's open for any of you.
Well, I'll start and say that it is evident in how our incoming class, the demographics of our incoming class is changing, that international students are a priority for the university. That being said, right, we are somewhat limited in the fact that with regards to some rules regarding visas, they're only able to sort of technically come to campus a week or two before classes start. So I think, we might have to re-examine that in order to allow for some more time to have sort of conversations like this, right? I mean, it's hard in 1 week right before classes with so much on your mind now trying to have these really difficult conversations which could be complex due to any number of reasons for folks. So I think we'd have to solve that systematic issue of sort of the timing in order to really start having those conversations be valuable.
If I might add, I absolutely agree in terms of the timing, but I also believe that not one training module is going to fit everyone, and I think international students really have specific needs that we as a university haven't really done exactly the best job in addressing. And, you know, as our office interacts with more international students, yes, we definitely see a difference in the ways in which some international students will understand or not understand the quote-unquote American experience, right? And so I definitely see a disconnect with the ways in which students will talk with each other and or connect with each other or not connect with each other, and it really begs to question how we're addressing our international student needs, and the fact that there's a major gap. So this, I think, is a very important topic, but again, I think with all training modules, we really have to think about the population specifically and address the needs as appropriately as we can.
Right. Do you have anything to add to that, Kevin? No? Okay. Other questions, comments from the audience? Yes, thank you.
Hello, panel and everyone here. My name is Michelle Thomas, and I'm a little bit unusual here as a student because I'm far older than most of the students here, obviously. But when I was a student at Rutgers in the class of '77, which in 2017 marks 40 years ago, I have this incredible experience right now of experiencing the campus and the students and what's going on here at Rutgers again, and in comparison to what was. And at the time that I was here before, the things you're talking about now were just getting started. And it was primarily focused at that time on things that had been going on in the 60s and 70s. And so it was mostly a black-white polemic. And now I'm overjoyed to see this growth and this general co-acceptance and inclusion of everyone, and that it's not okay to just ignore people and treat them as invisible. I think that the changing demographics of not only the country, but this is also a microcosm of that it's vital for everybody's growth and continuation and effectiveness for us all to embrace exactly what we're doing here tonight. One thing I did notice in closing is some of the professors I have could experience some of what we're doing in here, because I've had to correct a couple of people and they took it from me more easily because a lot of them I'm older than they are. And so they could say, well, I say, you know, for a quick example, this whole idea of calling people of color troubles me. And the reason it troubles me is because it's sort of a cop-out. It's sort of saying, well, this is the rule, this is the lesson, but for people of color, it's different, like it was a footnote. To me, what my ears are hearing is, this is the standard except for these people. And I don't really like that. I don't like minority because there's nothing minor about me. Okay? And I don't think it's fair to the person next to me. Like one of my professors, I said, why do you keep using this of color thing? I said, because if I flip it, then how do I describe you? Not of color? Of no color? How does that work? And so I'm challenging us to think about this, because when I said that to her, I could see she felt a twinge of what we're talking about. And it wasn't intended by me to hurt her, but to make her recognize the power of the words we choose. They're very powerful. And we need to keep working on how to revise. We don't need to stay with the same thing. If that doesn't work next week, we should erase it and try to grow into something new. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
So I just want to say there actually, as we're doing this training, we've noticed that a lot of students are talking about their experiences specifically within the classroom. And also because there's a power dynamic there, not necessarily knowing how to react, if to react, and when to react. And so we've really been having conversations with students about things like, course evaluations, if it's something minor that you just sort of want the professor to think about post-course. If it's something major, we've been directing them to like ombuds or bias. And I think primarily the main issue that comes up actually as we're doing this training is the issue of pronouns within the classroom, specifically for our transgender and gender nonconforming students. And not necessarily the non-desire to use the correct pronouns, but the inability and lack of practice to use the correct pronouns. And so also we're talking to students about time, and that these things take time to change, and these conversations need to happen over and over again, but that if you are exhausted, that's okay too. Let us as staff have these conversations as well. So I think we're getting a lot of outreach, and there's things around race in the classroom. I mean, it's not just the classroom, it's all over campus. And, but I do think we're trying to build students up to have those more difficult conversations.
Can I just address the of color thing? I think you're right. I think that language is always changing. The term of color probably came around in more practical usage or daily uses like in the 90s because of your previous or your other comment that minorities didn't want to be called minorities anymore because they didn't want to be called, they didn't want it to be presumed that there's a group that's major and a group that's minor. And so then in student affairs and other social services, they started to use of color to take away from the word minor or minority. And then some people proposed to say non-white, but then non-white is now still comparing that white is the norm or the standard, and then you're the non-group. And then others say, well, do we even have to group them at all together? Can we just say Black students, Latino students, Asian students? So it's just, it's a work in progress. I don't think, practically speaking, I don't know what to call people if that's the case.
I think we should just call people what they are.
Sure.
By their names.
We may not know where in Asia everybody is from.
Absolutely.
But we can say they're Asian people or Asian descended people, or somehow to acknowledge that just like people have, as I was growing up, everybody would say, well, he's a French person, he's Italian, he's from England, this person is from here, but it was all about Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And this is still the fallout from that Eurocentric standard that
Sure.
we have not gotten away from.
And then there's the practical aspect of it. If you want to address specific issues regarding students of color, you have to call them something, right? So like, for example, if there are disparities affecting communities, we call them certain communities. So I understand what your point is. I just think that people use categories out of convenience, and we continue to do that on our census. We have people check boxes still, which for a lot of people is a microaggression. We categorize people by gender, and for a lot of people who don't fit the male or female binary, that's a microaggression. So I think we just need to, we definitely need to just, what you had mentioned, just reevaluate, work on it, work through it. So I agree with you completely.
And if I just might add, identities are just very complex, right? And I mean, even here at Rutgers, let's just talk about the Asian American experience or the Asian experience. We have students who are first generation, second generation, third generation. We have students who speak one language, two languages, multi-language. We have students who are adoptees. We have students from a transnational experience. We have students who are undocumented. So that, identities, and it's just so complex. And what I'm finding is it's really about asking them about their experience, right? Before I'm going to sort of put a stamp on them about who they might be or who I think they might be. And it comes down to serving the students as holistically as possible.
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, I think that's what I think is great about this program, right? It's called Language Matters. It's not called, this is the language you should use, because it's a work in progress. It's saying language is important. We should talk about it. We should think about it. And, we're about to do 13 sessions. Every single one is going to have orientation sessions. Every single one is going to have a different outcome and someone who feels differently about language. And what we want is our students to think, I need to think about how my language impacts others. Not, I have to say this, because that would be not only stress-inducing, but impossible, right? We want it to just say, it matters, and I need to start thinking about it. And I need to ask questions, and I need to make sort of movements in that direction. So I think the title is perfect. It matters. It's not, we don't have the perfect answer. We're hopefully getting a little closer.
And I think part of the training, and for those of you who've gone through this will sound very familiar, it's not about diversity, right? I think we often talk about diversity as a university. We are an incredibly diverse institution in many ways, not just around race and ethnicity. I think what this training is really getting to is that idea of inclusion, or in the very least working towards it, right? So diversity is we're all here. Inclusion is we're all listening to one another. And that really, truly does feel different on campus, and that's really our goal with this campaign.
And I would hope the next step is engaging. Including and also engaging. So when I left Rutgers, I got to, last Christmas, I flew all the way 10,000 miles to Nigeria to spend Christmas with somebody I met right here when I was a student. I went to Germany for Christmas with somebody who I met right here. And we're still friends. I can still pick up the phone. We made a joke once and say, hey, let's all the nappy-headed hoes from Rutgers call each other. Remember when there was the big hoopla here? And we were all making jokes about the fact that we had once been here at Rutgers and someone made this comment, So now, though, the thing is that if people will engage with each other, that's what I didn't see at Rutgers, and I don't know that that's still the case here. That all the people from their various groups, if they take the chance to say hello, I think they'll generally find a good result on the other end. Might be bumpy, but good result.
So thank you, Michelle. Those of you who are much too young to remember that reference. That was a reference to Don Imus about the women's basketball team when they had reached the Final Four a few years ago. Any last questions or comments from the audience? Oh, Alex, to the stage. I mean, to the mic, not the stage. Don't come to the stage.
So I have a bit of a long and possibly rambling question, but maybe it'll be worth it. And I think it's primarily for Professor Nadal, but anyone who has experience with this should weigh in. And it's inflected through my experience doing training for several years and now sort of working as a bureaucrat within the regulatory state. And I'm wondering what happens on the far side of training, right? So training will get you, 50, 60, 70, 80% of the way you want to go. But beyond that, that's where you need sort of regulation and legal mechanisms to, move you fully to the world that you want to inhabit. And I'm wondering if you've had any conversations with your colleagues at John Jay, or if anyone has had conversations around this, because I think the regulatory and legal world is where the difference between motive and impact makes a huge difference, especially since impact is more sort of a civil litigation kind of thing, right, where you think about the damage that's been done to someone, whereas in the traditional kind of prosecution of hate speech and hateful behavior, that's a criminal act where motive matters quite a bit. So it seems like microaggressions is a new area of research, fall kind of hazily in between the two. And I'm wondering how, after you've done as much training as you can, and you still have, 10, 20, 30% of your population resisting or misbehaving, and you need to regulate or criminalize certain kinds of behavior, how you manage to do that given these new concepts.
Sure. I think the first reaction I have is that microaggressions as a concept hasn't been even examined in the legal world, and that it's something that a lot of people are resistant for that very reason, because it's hard to prove or support that a microaggression is based on malicious intent or whatnot. And so that's something that is bad, and that now that concept isn't something that can be applied to legal cases, but it's also something that defines exactly what we're talking about, those instances that are hazy. And so to some degree, it wouldn't ever make it to the legal world because it's something that isn't necessarily something that can be legally defined. With that being said, we even look at some of the problems with overt discrimination and the justice system, that when we look at hate crime law, for example, that a lot of cases aren't being prosecuted as hate crimes because there wasn't enough evidence to support that it was based on hate or on hateful intent. Even though there is a lot of either witnesses or other evidence that might point to that there still isn't enough to bring it to the court system. So if they can't even prosecute hate crime laws, or those can't be defined, then I don't know that microaggressions, at least in upcoming years, will be able to be implemented as either. In terms of trainings, I think one thing that I'm genuinely impressed by here is that you found a way to integrate social justice training and microaggression training institutionally and systemically, versus at a lot of other campuses, they ask me or someone else to speak, and then that's it, the institution does nothing. So I think if you belong to some sort of institution or workplace environment that implements something that either trains or provides that safe space for people to talk about microaggressions, or provides that safe space to talk about microaggressions in the context of harassment, then that already is a great step towards being able to address it. I've also heard, we talked earlier about the reactions to hate biases. A lot of campuses don't know what to do when there are hate biases, but if you have this team that's in place already, then that's a systemic way that you can address, or at least try to address these instances or minimize these instances from occurring in the future. So there is a big difference with systemic support. There's a big difference if a president or a chancellor invites me or one of my other colleagues to give a training on microaggressions, and they stay throughout the whole thing, and then they give monies for people to address these sorts of issues, versus people where it's just a one-time training that it's not going to do much unless there is that support. So even speaking to the City University of New York system that I belong to, we have a lot of people that do a lot of work on social justice issues, and so that helps with a lot of the band-aiding, meaning that if there is some sort of instance, we can turn to our professors and researchers and student affairs officers on how to deal with the situation, but because there aren't any large systems in place to address these issues, then it continues to be a problem on our system. So I do commend here for all of you, and it sounds like you have support from the higher ups as well, to address social justice issues. I love what you said about diversity versus inclusion, because I think a lot of campuses pride themselves on diversity, but they don't do anything to address inclusion and even engagement. So systemic support definitely can help. And while non-systemic support can help in terms of starting conversations, systemic support will help in helping those conversations to be more consistent and to be addressed throughout the entire year.
I also think we just generally have to be careful when thinking about the legality of things like microaggressions, bias. I think when we rely on the criminal justice system, we already know how that system is flawed, right? We already know that it goes to over-police communities of color, right? We know that that's how hate crime legislation actually works. It gives more resources to police precincts to already over-police communities, right? When we talk about gentrification and things like that. So I think what Language Matters, that's neither here nor there, that's a whole other program. You should come on April 9th with Lisa Dugan when we're talking about queerness and public policy and the expansion past marriage. Come out. But I think what this campaign is really doing is getting people to think about caring about one another. And I don't necessarily know that necessarily needs a criminal component or a legal intervention. I think it may need an educational intervention, but ultimately it's about growing that sense of compassion so that you care about the communities that you're creating. And honestly, I think it's working. And we don't know yet. We have 6,000 students to go. And then in 4 years, if we do this every single year, that means every single undergraduate student, for the most part, will have gone through that training. And that's when we're really going to see the real impact.
Right, exactly. I mean, perhaps we're slightly starry-eyed and naive, but, 3 years from now, we're going to make some impact through hegemony. We're going to have more people on campus who have gone through it than who haven't. And there, at that moment, then we've turned it around, right? So hopefully it's like, I can't remember the movie reference I was going to make right now, but 21 Jump Street, where everybody's so socially just in the school, and the kids come back and they're like, what? And they're like, man, that's not cool. Don't do that, right? So I do that. I mean, again, maybe it's not, we're being naive, but I think at some point we're just going to have a critical mass, and hopefully that starts, and maybe we inspire the world to do this on their college campuses. And again, it's the slow roll. You got to be okay with the slow roll, right? We got to be okay with it taking a couple years, but we got to start somewhere, and fortunately we're going to do it together. So.
And this campaign is actually already being replicated on a University of Wisconsin campus, I forget which one, and then American University. And so there are several other offices around the country that asked for the original of the online component, not just the poster, and they're editing it for their campuses. So I told them, you can keep it and you can edit it, but you have to send it back to me at the end. So at the end of it, we'll have a bunch of different examples of what Language Matters looks like on other campuses in the country.
So I think that we'll conclude with that optimistic note, but I wanted to just offer one concluding remark, is that this is back to the vision that Matt has painted for us in terms of on campus, but also addressing Alex's point, is that hopefully that what we're doing here while students are in college, that they're taking away the lessons that they're learning as well into the workforce, so that we are going to create a society. Just, Michelle, I really like your word about coexistence, right? So that whatever we're learning on our college campuses will then be translated into the real world, which, obviously has a lot to be, needs a lot of change as well. So please, Zanetta would like to make a...
Shameless plug.
Never shameless.
Never shameless. So I just want to say, it doesn't matter how many safe communities we try to create on campus if students do not have access to them. And so upon your way out, we have some Gabriel calendars for you all, but right beneath the Gabriel calendars is a fundraiser that we are running in addition to the Rutgers Foundation and also the Office of the Deans of Students for an LGBTQA specific student emergency fund. We were trying to raise about $20,000 and we released it 6 days ago, and we are 20% there today. And so this money will generally go to students who have been rejected by their families and need the additional funding to stay on campus, take credits, commute if they're living somewhere else, get meals, basic survival, right? Essentially, this fund will allow some of our most vulnerable students to stay here, to graduate and to be financially independent. And so if you are interested in learning more about that and sharing the word, please go ahead and pick up a card right outside.
And if you don't have the financial means to do it,
yes,
you should take a card anyway and share it with someone who you do know has the financial means to do that. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and I would invite you to have some more dessert and coffee and continue the conversation. Thank you.